afternoon. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Kai and Paris for inviting me as probably one of the more junior people who are given the stage today and tomorrow. And I'll be discussing in this musical context session, trying to situate the perception of timbre really into both orchestral and also electroacoustic practice, because that's actually where I ended up at due to kind of a move between universities. So first I would like to establish what musical practice really means, or what I mean by that. So how can timbre perception actually be situated in? What I mean by musical practice is also the moment when music actually manifests itself in sound. So it's the sounding moment, which means in electroacoustic practice usually with loudspeakers. In orchestral music it is the actual performance too, with performance then actually being one of the focuses I had in my previous research. And I'll be today just looking at two quite different genres really, just based on kind of my biographical story of the last few years. And then what function timbre also assumes in each case, because that could be quite different in terms of what the sounding nature of each genre really implies. And so the current focus for this talk is going to be more of theoretical nature really. I won't be presenting much of my work in detail. It will only really illustrate what I might be getting at on a larger theoretical and conceptual scale. So I would like to discuss the concepts of timbre and their significance to practice in each of the two. So by even identifying what are the shared aspects across the genres, but maybe also specific to each of the genres, and see whether we could at some point arrive at some agreement whether there is such a thing as a general timbral definition across different musics. So the musical context in the focus today is part one is going to be orchestral ensemble playing, which I'll be scratching on a bit, because that was my doctoral research on timbral blend conducted at McGill University together with under the supervision of Stephen McAdams. And since then I've actually moved on to electroacoustic composition, because I happen to have taken on a position at the Montfort University in the UK, the city of Leicester, where, as you'll find out, there is a very strong focus on electroacoustic practice. So first of all, to start talking about timbre in terms of more musical terms, because in the talks leading up to this session, we've been doing or talking about a lot of fundamental research, and now I'm just trying to take that notion but apply it actually into music. And so what my notion of timbre really is at this stage is it is perceptual. So in general, we assume the perception really relies on establishing a timbral identity or an entity. So if we're not talking about a sound source, but of a larger thing, I might want to give it a different name and call it entity in that case. And what timbre essentially then is, what I think I've taken out of my understanding through my doctoral work, is really that timbre is an emergent perceptual quality that is, as Stephen already pointed out, based on auditory grouping. And that can concern many things depending on the sounds we're listening to. So it could influence or entail spectral fusion, blend, or similarities between sounds, and other Gestalt principles actually of grouping that are known, such as even common fate or good continuity on higher levels. Timbre in a single or isolated sound is something I would like to focus on for now, because there are two aspects I would just want to point out, which are probably nothing new to you. For one, there's the aspect of the sound category, and we've talked a lot about sound source recognition today, so that's already covered. But then it's not just the source identity itself, as oftentimes you might even be able to relate a cause to what is causing that. Well, not just where it's coming from, but what is causing it, what kind of actions or mechanisms or filters are involved. But it might even go up and in semantic level to having some certain meaning or some certain associations that might be then generated. And on the other side, we've got the other aspect, which is more of sound quality, of really sound characteristics that may either span continuous scalable dimensions, such as the underlying multidimensionality of music, but it could even be specificities that are just specific to a certain sound that doesn't really equate on any continuum given the sounds that might be you might be looking at. But then on the other side, The sound category and the sound qualities, for now, well, as we saw before, they are just dealing with single or isolated sounds. And now we're thinking about higher level notions of timbre that might actually get us closer to how it might be implied musically. So the question there is, and this is something I've asked myself in my work at McGill, is what is the notion of timbre to composers or orchestrators? What notion do they employ? Is it really just an isolated concept for an isolated sound, or is it a higher level understanding for timbre? And on the other side, since performers then are actually the ones that will execute it in practice or generate the timbre as we experience it or as we could record it via microphones, what are actually the constraints and the affordances that the instruments provide or, to the performance and how they experience it, because in certain ways the instrumentalist cannot reinvent the timbre of that instrument. There are certain constraints to it, but then what are the affordances in terms of how they might be able to influence that during performance? The third question then, in terms of high-level notions of timbre too, is what are the limits of the timbral identity or the timbral entity? Talking about more electroacoustic music, where oftentimes you might not even have a sound event which is isolated in time, but you might have a continuous timbral evolution. Is that all conceivable as one timbral identity? So to start with orchestral music, I would also like to just put up, Stephen's already done that a bit. This is a simpler case, just to point out what orchestral music usually entails is the notation, where on one side or on one of the two spatial dimensions we just have pitch relationships, on the other we have time. And what else do we find in the notation, in the actual staff notation, is then perhaps an indication of dynamics, of what loudness each of these instruments is going to play. But what always remains vague in terms of remaining quite vague or just implicit is really what timbral nature will have, because that's only implied through the instrumentation assignments we have on that side. So that's just to establish actually that the notation is quite important in terms of how timbre might be defined or confined in instrumental music. So of course we all know the ANSI definition of timbre as, and I won't just quote it, but my interpretation of it is as that residual quality which distinguishes sounds from one another once we equate them for pitch, loudness, and duration. But to musical practice, as we saw before, usually you won't be playing a single pitch, a single loudness, but then you will have varying pitches, varying instruments, varying durations, and dynamics all playing at once. So it bears really limitations to musical practice, which are quite serious. The one is that if we strictly adhere to the definition, we would just always have to study under isolated or identical note context, which of course is quite limited. At the same time, it also actually disqualifies any sounds, any musical sounds we might consider musical that actually don't have a pitch, meaning we wouldn't be able to even equate them in that case. So that's another problem. So just to point that out, which probably is nothing quite new to you. Then timbre in musical terms might then actually look at quite different things which don't really fit within that ANSI definition. So as I said, the notation already establishes clear dominance of the pitch and the rhythm and the dynamics, which doesn't allow us to just stick to the ANSI definition. And then from two studies at least, it has also been found that the musical context actually mediates the importance of how timbral features are perceived. That the musical context might only define which of the dimensions become important in a certain case, whereas they might have all become important in the isolated case in MDS studies and identification studies. Then finally, also we need to consider the musician's notion really of the instrumental timbre, which is more likely not just going to be defined at a violin at a certain pitch at a certain dynamic, but then the violin timbre itself will be definable or generalizable within certain bounds of pitch registers, dynamics, and articulation. And that's probably just the musical understanding that musicians would have. And in terms of previous research, having conceptualized these notions in terms of terms, I might just want to put up a few. Handel and Erickson conceived of the idea of the source timbre, meaning that is kind of the generalized aspect of the source having its timbre, which is generalized across pitches, dynamics, and other factors. Then on the other side, as we've already had somebody announce early on, we've also got the notion of structural or transformational invariance, which is related to ecological psychology, but then Stephen, I imagine, is maybe the first person who applied it, tried to apply it to musical instrument descriptions. So in terms of this assumption that timbre, the answer definition, might just not be easily adopted into musical contexts, I tried to also establish or aim more towards defining what could the source timbre be from a very acoustical standpoint. So one of the things I did was look at such what I have termed the pitch generalized spectral envelope, which might be considered something that might define the instrument per se. Because this revisits an idea of Christoph Reuter, who has, not just him, but then he's worked on it quite a bit, in terms of that form and structure can actually be applied from the human voice description to certain instruments, primarily wind instruments. And so I went about analyzing spectra of wind instruments, such in this case is a horn, where you can see these circles, which are actually partial tones, which are accumulated across the entire pitch range of the horn, meaning across 38 pitches in this case. And if you see that distribution of partial tones across a cloud, you can see there's a common tendency to it. And if you fit a curve to it, that is what I call the spectral envelope estimate, or the pitch generalized spectral envelope, because you can see that there is actually a spectral notion which characterizes this instrument, where you could say this is a main formant, that could be a secondary formant, and that doesn't actually vary across the pitch range of the instrument as much. So that's that notion. But if you then add the variable or the factor of dynamics to it, you could even do, again, that's just to kind of situate the idea of that there's also a spectral centroid related to that. If you then apply that to dynamics, which I think Stefan Weinziel is going to talk about a bit more today, you could even do that for different dynamic levels. So this was the case for mezzo forte, but if you compare then to a lower dynamic such as piano and then also to forte, you can see that actually the frequencies towards the higher, the spectrum towards the higher frequencies will actually be elevated as the dynamic levels increase. And that's just to start off really in terms of how I went about describing instruments to arrive at, okay, the horn has a certain characteristic spectral envelope which is roughly constant across frequency. The bassoon happens to have the same thing, and since my study was on timbre blend between instruments, actually at that time, I was interested in seeing how do performers actually adapt to each other in terms of trying to blend together. What do they do with the possibilities the instruments give them? Or how do they adjust to each other? So I studied that. I'm not able to go into much detail in terms of also leadership relationships as one instrument leading the other and the other following. What I will focus on for now really is looking at what we can look at in terms of spectral adaptations from one instrument to another. So in the same color coding we had before, this red curve represents the formant location, which is roughly constant, but as you can see it does vary. And then on the blue curve is the spectral centroid variation across this musical excerpt which is being played, and this white curve is then going to be the pitch, or the fundamental frequency of that instrument playing. And in case you're wondering that this spectrogram, what you have, you're probably familiar with, why it doesn't actually outline the partial tones, is that this isn't a partial tone or a regular FFT, but it's actually a spectral envelope estimate. So what we're seeing is basically the spectral envelope outline drawn up in this representation. So I'll just start playing this little example. And the interesting thing to note is that you do see that there's spectral variation with pitch, because with pitch moving, you will see that the spectrum is varying with that at the same time, which of course is a confound. If you're trying to measure spectral adaptations between two instruments that are solely based on timbral adjustments, pitch in this case is going to confound that. Because with any pitch change, of course the spectrum will be moving at the same time. So in terms of analyzing this data, and that's the actual point I wanted to point out, is that you actually need to remove all of those confounding things. So analyzing musical context becomes increasingly difficult as you need to filter out these confounding factors. For one, that could be intonation. For one, it could be even errors, playing errors, which you need to rule out. On the other hand, it could also be spectral covariation, such as in this case, you can see that what we quantified here, and I just need to speed up because I just missed, I spent too much time, I think, on the first few slides. What I want to summarize on this slide, just briefly, is actually there is spectral covariation between horn or for horn players and for bassoon players, if you quantify how the fundamental frequency co-varies in a Pearson correlation across all the time points we have available, which is quite a bit in these performances, then you can actually see that pitch has quite a strong covariation, which for the spectral centroid goes up to 0.8. And the horn case, that is comparable, and that actually is, and these error bars are actually based on music or musicians. So in this case, you can see that there's hardly any variation between musicians. That pitch always will have a co-varying influence on it. On the other side, if you look at variation that is induced by dynamics, for example, such as sound level, as you can see on this side, then there is much more variation actually for bassoon players, but not necessarily horn players. So that's instrumental specificities that actually have to be taken into account and might be problematic in this case. So now, that was 5 minutes, right? Okay. So now I really need to speed up a bit and talk about electroacoustic music, why I ended up there, where I am, or why I became interested in it, is that I'm a member of a research center where everyone but me is a composer. And most of them are electroacoustic, composers of electroacoustic practice, meaning that for some reason I found myself, and there are no players either, there are no musicians there. So I had to reconfigure a thought, well, why not work with this, what I have, and look into timbre and electroacoustic music, because that is actually a redefinition of sonic musicality in certain ways. Because we're not talking about electronic music in a popular sense, but we're talking about electroacoustic high art music, to make well. So what we're dealing with there really is an infinite palette of sound material. It could be recorded, could be processed, it could be synthesized, which then actually greatly, to some ears, challenges the previous notions of musical timbre. Because of course this is nothing that will always give us a pitch, that will always give us a notion of dynamics, and how do you actually work with that musically, or even conceive of that in timbre terms. Chion in '94 actually distinguishes between two modes of listening, which map quite well onto the distinction of sound source and sound qualities in terms of talking about the causal listening, which deduces cause based on sound source identification. On the other side, reduced listening, which looks at inherent sonic characteristics such as pitch and timbre and other things. And there's an important significance in electroacoustic music in terms of the source and the cause, because in instrumental music, of course, we might even be able to transcend from listening to the oboe and identifying always the oboe, because it is the oboe, and we're listening really more into the qualities of the oboe. In this case, there is the notion of source bonding that's Smalley establishes, which is hardly suppressible human tendency to link a sound to its cause, especially if it's an environmental source, which might be used in a musical context. So he, and I might not be able to go into this too much, then it's just talking about this ability or this tendency of bonding kind of a source, and that might actually be a confounding factor in perceiving sound qualities in this kind of music, because we are hard-coded to certain extents to listen to that, because this reduced listening might not always work as much as we want to do, because these might be conflicting each other in certain ways in listening to it. And so, I have a few more minutes left.
Yes.
Yeah, because I can't actually see it standing here. So I might then just quickly scratch on the topic of spectral morphology, which on the other side to the source bonding nature, or the source nature of sounds in terms of the electroacoustic context, actually looks at the intrinsic sound qualities. So this is the sound qualities which are central to the musical expression and discourse, which is called spectral morphology, as it kind of traces the temporal evolution of spectra, such as Smalley has established. And Smalley, based on that, actually has his own definition of timbre, which is a general sonic physiognomy whose spectral morphological ensemble permits the attribution of an identity. And furthermore, electroacoustic music actually explores spectral morphological processes commonly employed, analogies to gestures, growth, motion, and shapes, which I won't be able to talk about much, but what this implies is really that continuous nature as opposed to event-based nature of music necessarily, compared to a note-based notion of music, at least. And this is, I might have to then skip a few slides in terms of my very preliminary work I've done anyway on perceptual ways, to then come to a better conclusion. because now having discussed at least the concepts of spectral morphology and also of the source bonding, I would want to have a general discussion of really timbre between the two contexts. So timbre in music, the two different aspects we just discussed are actually found in each of the two genres, which are quite different in nature. So we have the sound source aspect of it, we have the sound characteristics aspect of it, represented in both of it. But what I would want to point out actually is that they might actually be quite different in terms of how they influence the music contextually and how they might affect the listening experience in certain ways. So is there a common cause in terms of trying to employ a wordplay here? In orchestral music, and this is something I might just have to jump because I'm really running across time, to then not even address this slide, but go to my final slide, because that will be, I think, a nicer. So now I would just like to close off by mapping timbre onto the two musical contexts, which I hope I've established in certain ways, because I established the notion, Smalley's notion of source bonding. So if we establish the notion that there is such a thing as the sound source, and we can either have a very strong bonding to it or a very weak bonding to it. And on the other side, our listening experience usually has certain attentional limitations. And attentionally, we might be focused on more the sound source aspect of the sound or to the sound qualities of the sound. I would like to now kind of map our two different genres onto this continuum and actually see how they might compare or not. And I tried doing that in terms of assuming orchestral timbre. If you at least assume orchestral timbre to be not as much linked to the sound source, you could always locate it more to the upper half. And you can actually see that gray square which is up there, which actually surrounds orchestral timbre and that one solo all the way to the right. So on that upper side, you could, for orchestral music, at least assume that sound qualities are always going to be in the main focus. But the sound source might still be different in terms of how the music is orchestrated. So in the solo case, of course, you're going to have more of a source bonding, which is clear. And Stephen, fortunately, already established the notions of the augmented timbre, which is the case where one main instrument might be identifiable, which is enriched by or embellished by another instrument. And on the other side, if we're talking about emergent blends, where you're ending up with a completely novel timbre, you might actually be on the weak side of the source bonding. And on the other side, if we now wanted to map the electroacoustic music onto this, it won't be necessarily a region, but how I understand it based on Smalley's notion is it's actually going to be this ascending line of a continuum where we have the sound source on the lower side of the strong source bonding. What happens there is that we have just the problem of listening to the music, identifying the sound source, and not being able to focus on the sound qualities or being distracted of it. Whereas on the other side, once we lose that sound source identity or bonding to it, only in that case do we actually employ the mode of spectral morphological listening, or the reduced listening aspect of it. And this continuum is actually something I would want to look more into in the future in my next few studies, which I still have to come up with, but that might be then a good closing point for now. And I thank you, and I hope that there will still be questions and not too puzzled questions from my side. Thank you.
Questions here? Was the question there? Correct me if I'm mistaken here. You said when you showed the spectral envelope that it didn't vary very much with frequency, fundamental frequency, but it varied a lot with dynamics.
It did. Well, in the dynamics case, I can go back to that slide. It was the bar chart,
in
right?
a difficult situation first, because I had the impression that you showed for the spectrograms, or they weren't really spectrograms because it was only spectral envelope across time, right? That there was variation with fundamental frequency.
There was covariation to certain degrees. As
but
you can see,
doesn't it go against the first, your first conclusion that it doesn't vary much with fundamental frequency, that it varies more when dynamics change?
I don't think I made that conclusion. So perhaps I said something wrong. So the problem is here that the main covariate we actually find with a spectral variation is the fundamental frequency, as we also see on the bar charts I have on the next slide, which I can show. What is of less of an importance is actually dynamics. So in the dynamics case, the horn players are much more, and I might call this up just quickly again. This shows it much clearer, I believe. So you see that the covariation with fundamental frequency in both instruments is very strong. It is strongest for spectral centroid, less so for formant measures actually. But then for sound level, it is much stronger and much more consistent for horn players, but it is less much the case for bassoonists where there's a lot of variability, and it is much lower. Does that answer it? Because this data, this is just a summary of basically all the performances we recorded.
Okay. Thank you.
I have this question about augmented or emergent bonding. To my perception, it's always clear when two instruments can blend or not. But most of the times, I'm not really sure when we can say that an instrument is leading and it's augmented by one other, or these two just merge together. So how do you decide or really define
which instrument in a performance context might be leading? Yeah, the way we approach this is actually assign leading and follow rows in both orientations and just see whether it works out in the same way or not. When the case, if you have a very dominant instrument in timbre and the other one is much more subtle, it might be the case that the dominant instrument will always have to lead because it's the subtle instrument which will be blending into the other instrument. In the case of the horn and the bassoon, they are quite similar, at least in lower dynamics in terms of the spectral envelope, that we actually achieved the case that both were able to blend into each other within constraints of the instruments. The horn is a much more flexible instrument in its timbre variability.
Can I just?
Yeah, unless it's just others. Yeah, go for sure.
But does that have about has to do with the actual what's actually going on this particular musical moment, like which musician is leading, who's following? You understand the question?
Yes. Well, what we found, which I didn't quite address because I didn't want to go into the blending, is that actually the follower will usually blend into the timbre by making their timbres darker. They will blend into the leading instrument. So that's the approach. That's the spectral adjustment there actually is that takes place, and that actually takes place in both orientations. Yeah, that's still under review, that paper, but hopefully it will be available to a wider public.